now we, next session, session 4, right? International negotiations of trade policy. International negotiation of trade policy. After rising sharply at the beginning of the 1930s, the recession period, Great Depression period, the average U.S. tariff rate has decreased. The tariff rate actually is an indicator of liberalization. Right? In Great Depression period, featured by protectionist policy, imposing high tariff on foreign imports. Right? So tariff rate is very high. But after Second World War, tariff rate decreased and decreased and decreased. That is evidence of trade liberalization. Reduction in tariff substantially. Right? Tariff rate has decreased substantially from the mid-1930s to 1998. Since 1944, much of the reduction in tariff and other trade restrictions, what is other tariff? Non-trade, non-tariff restriction, import quota, subsidy, and blah, blah, right? Has come about through international negotiation, right? That is GATT, the General Agreements of Tariff and Trade. We said GATT, right? GATT, General Agreements on Trade and Tariffs and Trade, was begun in 1940 as a provisional international agreement, okay? So after Second World War, UN is established, right? Similarly, in the economic area, the GATT established. Why 2 times a world war happened? Because each country wants to protect their comparative disadvantage sector. At the same, they want free trade in comparative advantage sector. But problem is, for example, country A has comparative advantage in Q1, right? And comparative disadvantage in Q2. Then what happens? This home country wants free trade in Q1 and protectionist policy in Q2. Then what happens in the other country, for example, Europe, EU, European country? European country has comparative advantage in Q2. They want free trade in Q2 and protectionist policy in Q1. Then what happens? United States wants free trade in Q1, where European countries want protectionist policy. Okay? Also, European countries want free trade in Q2, where United States wants protectionist policy. Anyway, these countries impose high tariff in Q2. Right? European countries impose high tariff in Q1. So, all the products, right? High tariff imposed in all the products. So what happened? Great Depression happened and worldwide war happened, simply talking. That is a result of protectionist policy, just focusing on each country's welfare, right? And didn't consider foreign countries. Then how to solve this kind of problem? Solution is very simple. Free trade in comparative advantage and comparative disadvantage sector simultaneously by all the countries. Then what happened? In the United States, free trade, free trade. European countries, free trade and free trade. And anyway, in both countries, national welfare can increase. But in comparative disadvantage sector, some inefficient producers lose. But national welfare increase. So increasing national welfare can compensate fully for losers. That is basic system of GATT. Okay? So this one is GATT. And this one is, in 1995, this GATT is transformed into World Trade Organization. So GATT is provisional one and WTO is formal one, right? So this kind of some solution should be sought in this system, okay? Same thing happened in political arena, right? That is establishment of UN. Same thing happened in economic sphere. That is WTO got. So anyway, the conclusion is very simple. Liberalization of comparative advantage sector at the same time, disadvantaged sector simultaneously. Okay? So that is basic idea of multilateral liberalization. So in that sense, so now think about Korea as comparative advantage in Q1, for example, manufacturing sector, right? So national welfare increased like this. But agricultural farmers' welfare decreased by this one, right? That is negative, positive. So in sum, national welfare increased by this one minus this one, so like this. So using this one, we can fully compensate for this. Losers. That national increase in national welfare can be used to compensate losers. So basic idea of WTO is this one. WTO just try liberalization in all the sectors, competitive or incompetitive sectors of all the countries. And then each country's government is to solve this kind of problem, right? The compensation of losers is responsibility of local government. That is not responsibility of WTO. But you know that in UR or something, lots of Korean agricultural farmers strike against WTO in Geneva, for example, right? That is not so consistent with this kind of system, right? Just political action. Okay, so look at figure 10.5, the U.S. tariff rate. After rising sharply at the beginning of the 1930s in Great Depression period, the average tariff rate in the U.S. has steadily declined. The reduction in tariff means liberalization occurred. Okay? That is evidence of liberalization after Second World War. How that happened? Under the system of GATT or WTO, right? So, multilateral negotiations mobilize exporters to support free trade if they believe export market will expand. Okay? The support would be lacking in a unilateral push for free trade. The multilateral approach counteracts the support of restricted trade by import competing groups. So mobilize all countries exporting sectors. Okay? So counteracts these inefficient groups worldwide. Okay? Multilateral negotiations also help avoid a trade war between countries where each country enacts trade restrictions. Okay? A trade war could result if each country has an incentive to adopt protection regardless of what other countries do. All countries could enact trade restrictions even if it is the interest of all countries to have free trade. That happened. We already studied this kind of thing using prisoner's dilemma game, right? Countries need an agreement that prevents a trade war or eliminates the protection from one. What is that? That is establishment of WTO or multilateral trading system. Okay? So I'd like to skip this. Everybody knows this, right? Okay, the brief history of international trade agreement. In 1930, the U.S. passes a remarkably responsible tariff law, Smoot-Hawley Act, right? Everybody knows this. Tariff rates rose steeply and U.S. trade fell sharply. Initial attempts to reduce tariff rates were underbroken through bilateral trade negotiations. U.S. offered to lower tariff on some imports if another country would lower its tariff on some exports. Bilateral negotiations, however, do not take full advantage of international coordination, right? benefit can spill over to countries that have not made any concessions. Right? In 1947, a group of 23 countries began trade negotiations on the provisional set of rules that became known as General Agreements of Tariff and Trade, or GATT. In 1995, the WTO was established as a formal organization for implementing multilateral trade negotiations. Right? WTO negotiations address trade restrictions in at least three ways. Number one, reducing tariff rates through multilateral negotiations. Every multilateral negotiations, the purpose is just very clear. Reducing tariff, right? After sequentially at each multilateral negotiation process, right? Reducing tariff or liberalization. Number two, binding tariff rates. So, what is the meaning of a binding tariff rate? If a tariff is decreased, for example, declared to now 100%, after multilateral negotiation in UR, for example, the tariff rate decreased to 20%. Then, Korean government cannot higher this tariff rate. It's not possible to increase tariff rate above 20%. It's not possible. Only reduction in tariff, right? That is binding. A tariff is bound by having the imposing country agree not to raise it in the future, right? So tariff rate decrease and decrease and decrease continually. Number three, eliminating non-tariff barriers, right? So number two is decreasing tariff. Decreasing tariff, right? Binding tariff. Decrease and decrease and decrease. But we have, anyway, we know that tariff is the most important instrument of protectionist policy, right? But there are others, non-tariff barriers. We said non-tariff barriers. Important of non-tariff barriers is import ban. Most severe measure of protection is import ban, right? And import quota and PER or everything. That is non-tariff, right? So number three is eliminating non-tariff barriers, quota and export subsidies, domestic and export subsidy, domestic support, like this. All of these non-tariff barriers should be transformed into tariffs. We said that is tariff equivalent. Tariff equivalence, right? So in the last lecture, we studied that Japan and Korea's tariff on imported rice is 1,000%, right? You remember this, 1,000% tariff. How this calculated? In UR actually, right? So all non-tariff variable transform into tariff equivalent, right? And Korea and Japan so use this import ban measure in importing rice. So no foreign rice cannot be imported, right? This kind of measure should be converted to tariff equivalence. In other words, if Japan and Korea impose 1,000% tariff, then no import happen. Okay? So this measure is transformed into 1,000% tariff. Tariff equivalence. That is tariff equivalence, right? That is the meaning of this, right? Eliminating non-tariff barriers. Quotas and export subsidies are changed to tariff because the cost of tariff protection are more apparent and easier to negotiate. In UR, so although this kind of measures is converted to tariff equivalence, why? It's easy to negotiate with each other, right? So first step to liberalize all of this kind of thing is this one, right? So transform into tariff equivalence. Then next round, all the countries negotiate based on this, declares some tariff equivalence, right? It's very clear and evident. So here, because the costs of tariff protection are more apparent and easier to negotiate. Subsidies for agricultural exports are exceptions in UR. So subsidies for agricultural exports are an exception. Exceptions are also allowed for market disruption caused by surge in imports. That is safeguard. That is a safeguard, right? For example, in 1986, so lots of Chinese garlic imported in Korea. So Korean garlic farmers have a severe problem, right? So government activates safeguard measure to suppress imports from China. That kind of thing is possible, right? The World Trade Organization is based on a number of agreements, right? Number one is so number one is GATT, right? Covers trade in goods. The second is GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Services, covers trade in services. Trade in services is really important. Usually, developed countries, so production is focused on services, right? So developed countries has a comparative advantage in service sectors, right? Think about United States. And United States have no comparative advantage in goods production, manufacturing usually, right? For example, insurance, consulting, legal services, and banking. So gas covers trading services. And third one is TRIPS, agreements on trade-related, intellectual properties. Agreements on trade-related aspects of intellectual property, covers international property rights, for example, patents and copyrights. And number four is dispute settlement procedure, right? A formal procedure where countries in a trade dispute can bring their case to a panel of WTO experts to rule upon. Okay, so this one is DSM system something, right? This one is very important thing in UR agreement, and Professor Mundum's class also covers this issue, right? So before UR, small countries cannot argue against power countries, actually. But after UR, it is possible because of these dispute settlement procedures, right? The panel decides whether member countries are breaking their agreements. A country that refuses to adhere to the panel's decision may be punished by the WTO, allowing other countries to impose trade restrictions on exports. Okay, that is the dispute. Recently, this has a big problem now. WTO have a big problem, right? After recently. Okay, I would like to explain a little later. Now we study slide number 47. Actually, after GATT, right, there are lots of multilateral negotiation rounds repeatedly resulted in liberalization, right? Dillon round, Kennedy round, Tokyo round, like this. Every negotiations of each round result in lower tariff, okay? And recent conclusion of multilateral negotiations is Uruguay round, right? This one ratified in 1994, right? That is a recent one. After Kennedy, Tokyo, Dillon, and I forgot lots of multilateral negotiation round. Anyway, you are agreed that all quantitative restrictions on trade in textile and clothing, as previously specified in multi-FIBA agreement, were to be eliminated by 2005. Okay, I already explained, right? In early chapter of this session, MFA system prevailed until 2005. And at the UR, decided that establishment of WTO and ITC, right? So all this quota system abolished from 2006. Okay? This one is explained here. Quotas on imports from China had to be temporarily reimposed due to surge in Chinese clothing exports when MFA expired. So this kind of quota system abolished based on ITC, right? That is the earlier agreement. But unexpected result come after abolishment of MFA. How that happen? Right? Chinese share increased greatly, almost 50 to 60%, I think. Chinese share in U.S. clothing market is increased greatly. Because of this, some least developing countries' share decreased rapidly, right? For Costa Rica's share decreased, Vietnamese share decreased, and Cambodia's share decreased like this. So that kind of thing happened. That is cause additional problem. Then this LDCs, least developing countries, right? Low-income countries develop some share in U.S. market decreased greatly. This is a big threat to these LDCs, right? So how to solve this kind of problem? So that happened, right? So temporarily reimposed quota, right? Import quota temporarily reimposed due to surge in Chinese clothing exports when MFA expired. Okay? So actually in European market at the time is formerly EC market, but usually we said EU market, right? EU market same. EU's total textile and clothing share. This one is quota system, especially for lots of some African countries, developing countries, right? So we said that is US case MFA, EU case is maybe AGOA. I don't know what is the name of, I forgot, right? After abolishment of quota system from 2006, in the EU market, Chinese share increased greatly. So quota system reimposed in the EU market too. Okay? That is contents of 47. 48. In 2001, a new round of negotiation was established in Doha, Qatar. But these negotiations never produced an agreement until now. We said that is after, and this one is ratified, and next round is Doha round. Doha round or Doha Development Agenda round. So we said DDA, right? Doha round or Doha Development Agenda round, right? But until now, so member countries failed to reaching an agreement. Most of the remaining forms of protection are in agriculture, textile and clothing industries that are politically well organized. Okay? So now, American first policy by Trump and lots of problem happened recently. Now, why that happened? We have to think about this. Well, this one is stopped, almost stopped, right? Also, in the earlier slide, we studied dispute settlement, some procedure and system. right? This one is also is paralyzed. Okay? Why that happen? Until before you are reaching an agreement is very easy, right? The number one group of multilateral negotiation is U.S., number one country, right? Number two was EU, right? So usually before you are some countries, usually some countries who want free trade, right? So Korea and other some sort of small numbers of developing countries. So it's very easy. If U.S. can persuade EU, no problem at all, right? No problem at all. So lots of some liberalization agreement is not so difficult. But from UR, something changes. In UR, some major negotiating group in UR is the United States, EU, and CAONS group. CAONS group is food developing countries. Countries who export some agricultural goods, right? So member of this country is Canada and Australia and New Zealand, right? And Brazil, like this. Okay? CAONS group argues that free trade in agriculture, right? Like this. And we said S10. So S10, like this. I forgot the name. Usually food importing countries group. So Japan, Korea, and the other, some Indonesia and other countries like this. So it's very simple. And that is negotiating group. And major issues is also not so difficult, right? Agriculture, right? Agriculture and agricultural export subsidy and domestic support issue and manufacturing issue, manufacturing and service issue like this, right? So issue is not so difficult. In this, for example, manufacturing issue, developed country, US, EU, Japan, Korea want free trade in manufacturing trade, right? But developing countries, except some, until you are small numbers of developing countries, usually want protectionist policy. For this issue, developed and developing countries collide with each other. Can you understand? In UR. And service sector, only US and developed countries have a comparative advantage in service sector, and Korea and other developing countries have comparative disadvantage in this service trade, right? So they have some different idea for this. And agricultural export subsidy, actually United States is criticized severely by this CAONS group, right? And in domestic support, EU, Korea, and Japan is attacked by other countries like this, right? From this UR anyway, important thing of UR is lots of developing countries become a member of multilateral negotiation. So like this. Anyway, these groups compromise with each other and declare reaching an agreement on UR. But after UR, lots of problem happen, right? The power of US decreased greatly. EU also, EU's voice decreased. CAONS group separated by two, right? So, for example, developed CAONS group and developing CAONS group, right? So, differentiated. And also this group is anyway, nobody want to listen this group's idea, right? Because I'd like to explain a little later. We already studied this, right? Because the benefit from liberalization in this agriculture result in great increase in welfare all over the country, all over the world, right? And also China become a member of WTO. China have their own voice, right? So China and the other countries also voice increase. China and India and Brazil's voice increase greatly, right? So also there exists LDC group, least developing countries group, right? They don't have any comparative advantage at all. Poorest countries, lots of countries like this, right? But in Doha round, right? China, India, Brazil's voice increase greatly. And lots of developing countries join here, right? So it's really difficult to find some consensus on the agreement, actually. So agreement of MFA is total 100% of member countries have to agree, then declared, right? Not majority rule, right? So consensus rule, 100% consensus rule. So it's really difficult because of lots of voices from developing countries. So Trump's idea is very simple, right? This kind of multilateral liberalization is not so fruitful, okay? Because strong voice of developing countries, especially China, Brazil, and India like this. So we had to no more want this kind of multilateral liberalization process. We go, but we prefer preferential, some bilateral, some liberalization talk is more efficient than multilateral negotiation, right? So same thing happening in UN now, right? Members, developing countries' voice increase greatly recently, right? So all the lots of committees in UN, right, is overwhelmed by voices of developing countries. So big problem. But more problem happening in this WTO. Okay? That is the background why multilateral liberalization is staggering. And some protectionist, some policy is very popular